Right. I wish I had enough money so I just said, Jennifer, let's fly over to Bari.
I had an uncle that lived there. Maybe I have relatives in that.
Okay, we're moving along now. We're into the 15th century. And we're going to go to France. Or, well, we're going to go to where France is now. There was no France at that point. This is a map of what France looked like during that period. And what you see here is in blue is the House of Valois. The Valois dynasty were the kings of France, but they didn't actually control all of this. This was their portion that they held as royal properties, and this, and this little bit here, and this little bit here. All the rest of this dark blue were feudal properties held by various lords of varying degrees of loyalty to the king. This, and this, and this, and this were all held by the British, the English rather, the House of Lancaster. And this, and this, and this, they were all held by the Burgundians. Now the Burgundians spoke French, but they had no loyalty to the House of Valois, so they're an independent power. So we're getting into the period that's usually referred to as the 100 Years' War, which is a misnomer, firstly because it wasn't a war, it was a series of different conflicts. And secondly, it didn't last 100 years, it lasted more than 100 years. During this period, the English were trying to solidify their hold over what they held and also take the rest of France, the rest of what the House of Valois held. And they defeated France's armies in every big battle. The small battles went one way then the other. But all of the decisive battles were won by the English. Battles such as Crécy and Poitiers and finally Agincourt. The Black Death was running wild at this period. Estimates of the degree of mortality in France in a 5-year period, 5 years, 50 to 80% mortality.
Wow.
And in England, 30 to 50%. Why so much higher in France? Part of because France was more urbanized. Now, at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, Edward the Black Prince captured the French king, John II. This was an absolutely catastrophic defeat for the French because they felt it was necessary that they ransom John. So the English set him a ransom, slightly less than 6,000 pounds of silver. Think about that. That's pretty significant, and significant territorial concessions. So this was awful for France. It was they were almost bankrupted by trying to meet this this ransom amount, which they could not do. At one point, John II was actually released by the English to go back to France to raise the money, leaving behind some hostages. And when he couldn't, he went back to England, where he was kept in relative comfort. And he actually died without ever being ransomed. Later, Agincourt, Henry V, that was a complete disaster for the French. The number of their upper class men who were killed at that battle, the only thing I can compare it to is Hannibal's defeat of the Romans at Cannae. It was just, it gutted the upper classes. And it was so complete that the treaty that was finally signed 5 years later by Charles VI of France married his daughter Catherine to Henry V, and gave him power of regency and also the inheritance to the throne. In other words, he disinherited his own son, Charles, the Dauphin Charles, in favor of the English. It looked like the English had pretty much finished off the House of Valois. Well, that was 1420. 2 years later, Henry V and Charles VI, so the two kings, both died. And that left Henry's son, who was Henry VI, to be king of both France and the Valois kingdom. There was the commander in France was John of Lancaster, the English commander, Duke of Bedford. He held Parish, he held northern France, he had an alliance with Burgundy, and Brittany was sitting it out. They were neutral. So the former Dauphin, the one who'd been sold down the river by his old man, was uncrowned and generally unsuccessful. He had his, now, can I please see the one that says map of Joan? These are some significant places I'm going to be speaking about during this period. He called Bourges his capital. This is the French uncrowned king. But Chinon is where he spent most of his time. He had a big castle there. As you can see, most of France now is in the hands of the English. Most of the territory that we call France is in the hands of the English. Anyhow, Bedford decided we got to knock this guy off. So he began an English attack, and his intention was to capture or kill Charles and complete this. They came marching down from Paris, and they got to Orleans. And Bedford was not a great strategist. He had dispersed his troops pretty much up and down the Loire Valley in garrisons to defend against the French, which maybe necessary, maybe not. But he tried to besiege a walled city with fewer than 5,000 men. And he built some small fortresses around and it was a sort of a siege, but it wasn't really a complete siege. It was more sort of, let's see if we can starve them out. There was no way they were going to take the city by storm. Orleans was defended by good walls and 71 heavy cannon. They had more cannon than the besiegers did. A man named John Talbot was the commander of that particular force at the siege. He's essentially waiting for the city to starve. That's what he's doing. He's going to starve them out. The French commander was a man named Jean Dunois, and he had 2,000 real troops and 2,000 local militia, and he was waiting for reinforcements. So the bishop and a lot of the leading citizens of the city just left, and the siege dragged on, and the people began to feel that this was hopeless, that the king wasn't going to do anything for them, and that they were doomed, even though there was not going to be an assault. Meanwhile, supposed King Charles is in Chinon, ineffectively trying to put an army together to go to the relief of Orleans. And then a 17-year-old peasant girl arrived and volunteered to lead the expedition to relieve Orleans. She was known at that time as Joan the Maid. That's how she described herself, Johan la Poussette. And she was one of 5 children born in a village called Domremy to the family of a peasant farmer. And in about 1425, so that'd be 4 years before this, She began, she said, to hear voices and have visions. Visions of saints. And they were telling her that God had chosen her to drive the English out of France. This apparently continued, and in 1428, she went to the local officials there and said, God's telling me to go help the king drive the English out of France. And for some reason, they listened to her. And they gave her an escort, a military escort, to take her to Chinon, which is where the king was. It was about 250 miles from where she was. It was a fairly daunting journey. Oops, pardon me. When she was there, she had a private interview with Charles. And she delivered to him some sort of personal message, the details of which have never been revealed. It's still a secret, whatever happened at that interview. But she offered to not only raise the siege of Orleans, but lead the troops to Rheims. I know I'm mispronouncing a lot of these things. Way up here. So remember, the English hold all of this. And she says, not only am I going to raise the siege of Orleans, I'm going to take you to Rheims. Now, why Rheims? Remember I said Charles was the uncrowned king. It was custom, and more than custom, it was almost a sacred command that the kings of France be crowned in the cathedral at Rome. And that's the reason Charles hadn't been crowned yet, because he knew if he were crowned anywhere else, he would be seen as not the legitimate king by a lot of the people. So so Charles somehow decided to take a chance on it, but he wasn't completely sold yet. So he had her examined by a bunch of clergy in order to make sure that she was actually seeing and hearing saints speaking to her, and that she's not being deceived by the demons. So they said, yeah, she's good. This is the real deal. So he got her a suit of white armor, gave her a sword, gave her a little battle axe, a standard, a personal standard, personal flag, and a big black horse. One of the real strange things here, this really is a strange thing to me. Anyone who wrote about her, in terms of how she rode, said she rode very well. Now, how a peasant girl wound up learning how to ride well is beyond me, but that is what they all say. And this was a charger. This was a war horse. It was not a palfrey. So anyhow, and he didn't knight her, and he didn't give her an official rank, but some sort of vague status as a commander over the 4,000 troops that they had managed to put together. I've puzzled this one out. I've tried to figure it out, what exactly her status was. And it seems to be somewhere between good luck charm and mascot. Nobody expected her to pull out that sword and start chopping off English heads. But they carried her along to get there. So, the French Relief Army, staying south of the Loire, headed for Orleans, and late in April, the commander rode out. As I said, it wasn't a tight siege. They were hoping to starve them out by cutting off supplies. They didn't have a completely tight siege. So they were met by Dunois, the commander of the garrison at Orleans. And he was impressed by Joan, by her forcefulness and her confidence. And I think he needed this is what I'm saying. It seems to me it's quite likely that he knew that he needed a morale lifter for the people, and Joan could provide that. Okay, so early the next evening they rode into Orleans, and it was a torchlight entrance, and it had apparently worked. The word had gotten out. We have a miraculous savior. Crowds came. They came forward to touch Joan or the horse or whatever. They were putting their confidence in her. For the next few days, the French commanders tried to figure out how to use this. What's next? Now we got 4,000 more troops. Now we outnumber the English, so what are we going to do? Joan worked her way around the city and the garrison, talking to people, telling them what God had told her, telling them that she was going to do this and this and this. And she also, on her own authority, meaning none, sent surrender demands to the English commanders of these various forts that the English had built, fortresses. Apparently the English troops shouted out to her rather roughly, not particularly respectfully, but the French soldiers seemed impressed by her, and okay, she's here, she's going to lead us. A few days later, the 4th of May, they attacked the first of the English forts east of Orleans. Dunois led the attack. It was not going well. He was ready to pull back when Joan suddenly showed up. And she rallied the French, and they went forward and captured it. That was it, man. That made her reputation right there. She's now one of the military council, and she's going to be up front. I don't mean on the very front line, but she's going to be on the battlefield for all of these successive fights. While attacking one of the fortifications, a very important one, which guarded the main bridge over from the English side, over the river there. She was wounded. I mean, she was not way back. She was wounded by an arrow. And remember, in all these great English victories, a great deal of the credit can be given to the famous English longbowmen. But she was seriously wounded, but she still led an attack, encouraging the soldiers, and they took the place. The Loire Bridge was now French, and Orleans no longer isolated. The following day, the English drew up their army and challenged the French to come out to open battle, which they declined. But the English, having lost some of their major forts, particularly that one over the bridge, they pulled out. They pulled out. And on the evening of May 8th, Orleans celebrated. To this day, the second Sunday in May is the Relief of Orleans Day in Orleans. It's a huge holiday. It's not an official national holiday, but it's a customary national holiday in many other places in France as well. Now, this was not super duper heavy fighting, okay? There was no big, huge, one great big battle. As I said, the French had not done well in great big battles for the last 200 years. A few hundred men killed on either side. But it was clear that the tide had turned here. In only 9 days from her arrival, the English had pulled out. That's why I've been giving you all these dates. This was considered essentially a miracle. by the French. It raised Joan's stock about as high as you can get. and Bedford, the English commander, reported all this to London, that the French believed they now had a miraculous leader and that God was on their side and their morale was rising. And sure enough, they kept capturing these dispersed English garrisons, which was bad news for the English, believe me. Finally, on the 17th of June, the two main forces did have a relatively big battle. Not big by the standards of the ancient world, but big by the standards of the medieval period. About 5,000 combatants on each side. And they met here at Patay. As you can see, north of Orleans, the French were trying to move north. And the result of that battle, wait a minute, sorry, these papers seem to be, I wash my hands and I can't do a thing with them. The English began to prepare, as they had in all their winning battles, by digging their archers in. Now, I don't mean they dug trenches. I mean, the English archers, the longbow was part of the reason for their superiority. It was the main reason, but they also knew how to use them, and they knew they were somewhat vulnerable to cavalry attack if you get close enough to them. So they would plant long stakes. They actually carried these in wagons with them when they traveled. Long wooden stakes pointing outward, pointing at that end. And the archers deployed behind them. And they started digging in. Joan insisted that the army attack immediately. The other commanders, I think, wanted to wait till the next day to see what the English disposition would be. The English were utterly stunned. The French just hadn't done this sort of thing before. And they had huge losses. They lost most of their army there. The overall commander, Talbot, was captured. And the English, what was left of them, fell back to Paris. Patay was a decisive French victory, the first big victory they had had in a very long time. Then the French began to argue among themselves. What should our strategy be in this war? And Joan finally won Charles over. It was his decision. He was the king. And she said, we're going to Rheims. We're going to put a crown on your head. You're going to be anointed with the sacred oil that's kept only at Rheims Cathedral. And you're going to be king in fact as well as name. So there wasn't a lot of opposition. The English had been beaten. They were disorganized. They'd lost their commander. The advance to Rheims was less of a campaign and more of a triumphal procession. There was huge popular enthusiasm for her, and quite frankly, a number of the English commanders proved remarkably susceptible to bribery. So all in all, wasn't a lot of fighting, and they got there. Charles was crowned at Rheims. This is a turning point in French history of the period. He was crowned, he was anointed, and now he's the rightful king of France, and recognized as such. And both the French and the English have a feeling that the tide has turned. So, Joan's on her way back to a place called Compiègne, which I didn't put in there, I'm afraid, because it was under siege by the Burgundians. Remember, they're allied with the English. And as with Orleans, she entered Compiègne at night, as soon as she got there, on the 22nd of May. The next day, she led an attack out of the city on the Burgundians. And she knocked them back twice, but the English themselves showed up And they were, I'm not gonna go into the tactical details, but the point is, the English reinforcements showed up and Joan thought, we gotta get out of here. So they retreated out of Compiègne to cross the river, which I'm not even gonna try to pronounce. And she remained with the rear guard. Now they weren't supposed to stay there forever. The idea was they would fall back and hold the English back so the rest of the army could get across, and then they'd cross. The rest of the French army could get across, and they'd cross. In a skirmish, she got knocked off her horse, and she couldn't get back on. Not because she was badly injured. I suspect it was because the armor was too heavy. No, it sounds like David and Saul, right? Yeah. Anyhow, she surrendered. And with her brother Pierre and a man named Jean d'Aulon, she was taken to the Duke of Burgundy. Jean d'Aulon had been appointed to be essentially her bodyguard, if you want to put it that way. He was a French knight. This is where it starts getting really depressing. You're going to hear a lot about a fellow named Renaud de Chartres. He was the Archbishop of Rheims. He was a peer of France. He was the Archbishop Duke of Rheims. He was the guy who had actually anointed and crowned Charles. So he's sort of the equivalent of the Archbishop of Canterbury there. And later, he would be called upon to perform Charles's marriage. He wound up being made a cardinal. Charles had sent him on an embassy to the Duke of Burgundy. Remember, Burgundy was an English ally. Yeah. Renaud de Chartres accused her of rejecting all wise military counsel and of acting willfully. That's why he said she got captured. Her captor sent Joan and Jean d'Aulon to his castle in Vermandois. She tried to escape and failed, and he sent her off to an even more distant castle. And she was treated well while she was there. She was not tortured, she was not, bread and watered or anything, but she became deeply distressed that Compiègne, how do you pronounce that, Martha?
Which?
Compiègne. Compiègne?
Compiègne.
Compiègne.
I don't know.
Compiègne.
I've never even heard of it.
All right. Anyhow, while she was there, while she was in this castle, she became so distressed, she jumped from the top of a tower, not in an attempt at suicide, an attempt to escape. And she knocked herself unconscious when she fell in the moat. Apparently it was a dry moat because she didn't drown. And when she was recovered, she was sent to another place, a town under the control of the Duke of Burgundy. So on the 25th of May, the news of her capture reached Paris. The next day, the theology faculty of the University of Paris, which had sided with the English, requested the Duke of Burgundy to turn her over for judgment either to the chief inquisitor or to the Bishop of Beauvais, Pierre Cochon, because she'd been seized in his diocese. The university also wrote to the same effect to her captor, Joan of Luxembourg. And on July 14, the Bishop of Beauvais presented himself before the Duke of Burgundy, asking on his own behalf, and in the name of the king, I do apologize for this. that Joan be handed over to him in return for a payment of 10,000 francs. That's a lot of money. The Duke passed on the demand to Joan of Luxembourg, and a few months later, she was in the bishop's hands. It's now 1431, January. The trial was fixed to take place at Rouen in Normandy. Joan was moved to a tower in a castle called Beauvrieux. Could you show me, John, the thing that's marked prison? The building still stands, and that's it. And I didn't have to pay copyright on this because that's one of Gwen's photographs. That's where she was kept, in that castle, in that tower. She was brought to trial before a church court because the theologians at the University of Paris, as arbiters in matters concerning the faith, insisted that she be tried as a heretic. Now the truth is, her beliefs were not strictly orthodox in certain respects, but these are pretty technical mostly. The real truth is, she was seen as, there were two things operating against her. Firstly, she was seen as a threat by the church hierarchy. She claimed she communicated directly with God by means of visions and voices. And that threatened the hierarchy because, you know, we're getting back to the whole Hildegard of Bingen thing. Who's speaking for God here? Is it the recognized authorities or is it this peasant girl? Secondly, if they could get her convicted of heresy or even witchcraft, which they considered but didn't, that would discredit Charles VII by saying, yeah, he got crowned because of that witch or that heretic, which would discredit him. And those two things were working against her. And the deck was stacked, really stacked. Her two judges, two very interesting guys. One is Cauchon, the Bishop of Beauvais, and the other was a man named Jean Lemaitre, who was a Dominican friar who served as the Vice Inquisitor of France. I want you to remember that name, Jean Lemaitre, because he's going to pop up later. He was very reluctant. He did not want to take part in this at all. He was pressured and physically threatened to be a part of the trial. He missed most of the sessions due to illness. He did not like what he'd been asked to do at all. It looked dirty, and it was dirty. They didn't waste any time. On the 13th of January, they started the trial. There were statements that had been taken by witnesses from other places, and these were read. These witnesses did not appear in person. Finally, in February, Joan was summoned to appear before her judges. She had asked for permission to appear before them and been refused she'd asked for permission to attend Mass beforehand, but she was not allowed to do so because of the gravity of the crimes with which she was charged, to which they had added attempted suicide because of her jumping into the moat. She wasn't attempting suicide, she was trying to get away. She was ordered to swear to tell the truth, and she did so swear. But she she always refused to answer any questions regarding anything she'd said to Charles. That's one reason why we don't know about the content of that initial interview. Cauchon forbade her to attempt to escape, but she insisted that she was morally free to do so. At that point, guards were assigned to remain always inside the cell with her, always. And she was chained to a wooden block and sometimes put in iron. Could we see that, the picture marked statue?
I think we got it.
You got it? There is a museum in, right close to where her place of execution, and this statue features prominently in it. I had assumed, I don't know if I was told or not, I had assumed that this was a statue of representing her in confinement. It is not. It's a statue by a French sculptor named Henri Michel Chapoux. It was made in the 1880s. And the title of it is Joan at Domremy, which is where her home was. There were many, many, many copies of this made. Many copies of it. 2 or 3 of them are in Virginia. They were given to various, one's at, I think, Mary Washington, and the 2 others are at 2 other schools which, in that period, late 19th, early 20th century, in that period, they were women's colleges, and they were given copies of this statue. There are many, many copies of it in France and other places. I don't know a thing about Chapoux, but apparently it was very popular, highly regarded at the time. This is bronze. The original is in marble, I believe. She was interrogated many times. On every occasion, she had to swear again to tell the truth. But she always made it clear that she would tell the truth, she would not lie, but she wouldn't tell them everything they wanted to know. Because they were all, although they were French, they were all enemies of King Charles. And yeah, they were. I mean, they were. The report of all this preliminary questioning was read to her on the 24th of March, and she raised only 2 points that she said were inaccurate. The rest she said, yep, it's accurate. So now the preliminaries are finished, we're going to start the trial. They brought 70 charges against her. It took 2 days for her to answer the charges. They were primarily based on the idea that she had shown blasphemous presumption in claiming the authority of personal divine revelation, that she had prophesied the future, that she had professed to be assured of salvation, and that she wore men's clothing. So there. Of course, the most serious charge was of preferring what she believed to have been God's direct speech to her over the authority of the church. She was questioned again, 31st of March. This is moving quickly. Several points about which she had been rather evasive, primarily regarding the question of her submission of her own will to the will of the church. In her position, obedience to the court that was trying her was inevitably a test of that submission. After all, it was run by a bishop. She did her best to avoid the trap, but she said that it was to God and her saints that she held herself answerable for her words and actions. Trial continued. They reduced the original 70 charges down to 12. But they were the serious ones. And these were sent for consideration to a number of theologians, some in Rome, some those Parisian guys. Meanwhile, Joan fell sick in prison. She was attended by doctors. Cochon, the bishop who was in charge of the trial, visited her in prison along with a couple of his assistants, exhorting her to submit to the church. Joan thought she was dying. She was very ill, and she thought she was close to death. So she begged to be allowed to go to confession, to go to Mass, and to be buried in consecrated ground. This was refused. They continued to press her to submit. Her response, I am relying on our Lord. I hold to what I have already said. In May, they threatened her with torture. She answered that even if they tortured her to death, she would not reply differently. Adding that in any case, she would afterward maintain that any statement she might make had been extorted by force. Her interrogators, who numbered 13, voted 10-3 that torture would be useless. Joan was informed, late May, that acting under the decision, the advice of the University of Paris theologians, that if she persisted in her errors, she would be turned over to the secular authorities. You see, church courts could not execute anybody, but secular courts could. So it appears that nothing else could be done. So on May 24, she was taken to the cemetery of the Church of Saint-Ouen, where her sentence was to be read out. But they really wanted to punish her, so they made her listen to a sermon first. In the sermon, he violently attacked Charles VII, and Joan actually interrupted him, saying he had no right to attack the king, who was a good Christian, and should confine his judgment to her, not the king. This didn't endear her to any of those present. After that, she asked that all the evidence and records of the trial be sent to Rome for further judgment. The judges said, no, we're not going to allow you to appeal to the Pope. And they read out the sentence, which abandoned her to the secular power. Joan broke. She broke. She, in fear of her life, said that she would do all that the church required. She was presented with a form already written out for her signature, which said that she abjured all of her previous statements. She hesitated about signing it, but eventually did so. She was then condemned to perpetual imprisonment. In other words, life. And the judges sent her back to the prison.
Back to where?
The prison.
Prison.
Now, the Vice Inquisitor had ordered her to put on women's dress, which she had done. But 2 or 3 days later, she was back in male attire again. She said she made the change because she preferred men's clothes. They pushed other questions on her about why she had done this and so forth. And she said that the voices of St. Catherine of Alexandria and St. Margaret of Antioch had come to her and told her she had committed treason by signing the denial of her previous acts and work. These admissions were taken to signify a relapse into heresy. And on May 29, the judges and all the rest, there were 39 what were known as assessors, which are basically people who kind of look at the evidence and present their advice. The judges and the 39 assessors agreed unanimously that it was time to hand her over to the secular authorities. The next morning, she received permission from Bishop Cochon to make her confession and receive communion. Two Dominicans led her to the place of execution. There they gave her one more sermon, and the sentence abandoning her to the secular arm was read out in the presence of her judges and a great crowd. An executioner seized her, led her to the stake, tied her to it, and lit it. A Dominican friar attempted to console her. She asked him to hold high a crucifix that she could see and to shout out assurances of her salvation so loudly that she should hear him above the roar of the flames. To the last, she maintained that her voices were sent by God and had not deceived her. A few days later, the English king and the University of Paris formally published news of her execution. Could we see that, the picture of the execution site, please?
It's up.
It's up.
It's up? Okay. This is, you can see this. You go to Rouen, it's there. This is another of Gwen's photos. That is the exact spot where she was executed. Now, there's more to this story, but I'm going to interrupt it briefly. Because you're probably wondering, how does somebody who gets burned as a heretic wind up being a saint, or being named as a saint? But let's talk about a few things about her legacy, I guess. Joan didn't really accomplish driving the English from France. They were still there, believe me. And King Charles, who had made no attempt at all to get her out of this pickle, put not your trust in princes nor in any son of man. Finally, through the efforts of Regnault, whom I told you to remember his name, the Archbishop who said she was reckless and so on, he was successful in his embassy to Burgundy.
I
And
can't
Burgundy.
hear you.
Embassy to Burgundy.
Burgundy.
Can you repeat that whole sentence again?
The Archbishop who had refused to intervene on her behalf, and who in fact more or less condemned her actions when she was captured, had pursued this embassy to the Burgundians and convinced them to change sides. Now that totally changes the strategic situation. All of a sudden it's the English who've got two enemies, and one of them in very good strategic position. Only in 1450, when it was clear that Charles was going to win this thing and get the English almost out of France, did Charles order an inquiry into the trial. Okay. Papal authorities declared her rehabilitated in 1456. Rehabilitated, in other words, not just pardoned, but no, that was a bad verdict. That was rotten. But she still wasn't named a saint. Not until 1920. Almost 20 years afterward, 1450, had Charles VII ordered an inquiry into this trial, 20 years after her death. 2 years later, the cardinal legate, remember papal legates are like ambassadors, they represent the Pope and have tremendous authority. The papal legate, Guillaume d'Esteville, made a much more thorough investigation. And finally, following a petition from Joan's family, proceedings that had been instituted in 1455, Pope Calixtus III instituted a very, very thorough investigation into the trial and the charges and the sentencing. And we are deeply indebted, well, by we, I mean historians, I shouldn't say we, historians are deeply indebted to Pope Calixtus for this because they kept every scrap of paper they could get their hands on, and they're all still around, including lots of depositions. Here's a typical one. This was from the guy who was the bailiff at the trial, so he was there all the time. Indeed, the bishop, that's Bishop Cauchon, was staunchly supportive of the English faction, and many of the counselors, the assessors, the guys who were the advisors to the court, were in great fear and were not able to judge freely. For Master Nicolas de Houppeville, who didn't want to take a part in the deliberations after seeing what was going on, was banished along with a number of others. They just banished him from the country because he wouldn't go along. I mentioned that Jean Lemaitre, the vice inquisitor, the guy who played sick for most of the trial, had declined many times to take part in the trial and did his utmost to not attend the trial. But it was said to him by some persons of his acquaintance that unless he took part, he would be in danger of death. And he did so, thus forced by the English, as I had often heard from Lemaitre himself, who told me, I see that unless one acts in this matter according to the wishes of the English, death is imminent. And I myself, he's speaking as the bailiff now, was in great danger because while bringing Joan to and from the hearings, I came across a certain Englishman called Anquetil, a cantor in the King of England's chapel, who asked me what I thought of God, thought of Joan. And when I replied that I didn't know of anything but good in her and that she seemed to be a good woman, the cantor reported this to the Earl of Warwick, who was angry with me, and I had a great deal of trouble because of this. But I nevertheless managed to get out of it by making excuses for myself. There are many such things. By the way, you can access all of this online. I just picked one of the many depositions. And one other thing, I should have written this down, but I didn't. The entire trial, all of it, every aspect of it was paid for by the English. I don't know how much those people were paid, but it was something. This was as rigged as you can get. Joan of Arc remains both an iconic figure, particularly in the French imagination, but also a controversial figure. Her contribution to the political military history of France is significant. There's no question about that. But her contribution to the history of human courage and the desire for freedom of belief and speech and clean justice is probably greater. She was not victimized only by a foreign power. Remember, this war was not so much, it was not just a war between the Valois dynasty and England, it was a civil war in France as well. And the relief of Orleans was an important victory. more psychologically than anything else. But it didn't end the war, and her contributions didn't end the war. It went on for another 22 years. What won it for the French was Philip the Good of Burgundy changing sides. The nature of Joan's mission has attracted controversy from historians, theologians, and psychologists, not surprisingly. There's lots of controversy about her motives and the actions of herself and her supporters and her enemies. It's a very complex situation. One big one that I've already mentioned is the question of how she was able to win the confidence of Charles at that first meeting in Chinon. I mean, after all, he actually ennobled her family finally. By the way, would you put up that one other picture, please? Joan's coat of arms.
I think it's up there.
Oh, it's up, great. I need a double thing here. This is the coat of arms that she was awarded. And, the symbolism is obvious. The sword supporting the crown and the fleur-de-lis, which are among many other things. There are multiple symbolism. The heraldic fleur-de-lis, flower of the lily, was a symbol of the House of Valois and became a symbol of the kings of France for a very, very long time. But it also symbolized the Trinity, because it's threefold. And because the lily itself is not gold, but a very pure white, it became a symbol of the Virgin. So that symbolism is all pretty clear, I think. There's a question about what Charles did after his coronation. He did a lot of moving around France in what seems an almost random manner. Some people think it was a strategic thing. He was trying to induce the loyalty of people in various places he was worried about. Others just say he didn't know what to do, and he was a victim of perpetual indecision. Whether after another question that gets discussed, it seems small, but at the time it was big. When she resumed wearing men's clothes and said she'd done it of her own free will. Some people think the voices had told her to do it. Some people says that the English jailers had forced her to do it in order to have a reason to say she'd recanted. Later generations, from then till now, have tended to sort of hijack Joan's reputation according to their own political and religious viewpoints, rather than understanding it in the very complex and troubled situation of France in the 15th century. Remember, this had been the period just after the splitting of the papacy, and great loss of papal authority because of the conciliar movement. This was a movement to restore more power to the councils of the church, that is, the meetings of the bishops, rather than the papacy. And because of all this divided authority and questions about who really had authority, it was very, very difficult to get clean justice in anything regarding the church. Even the Inquisition itself, which was supposed to follow certain rules, was often affected by political influences, both ecclesiastical and secular. And believe me, Joan was not the only victim of an unjust judicial procedure. Her place among the saints is secured not by the historically almost, maybe not quite universally, but certainly most ecclesiastical historians would say that the various miracles attributed to her are at best very dubious. But what really has secured her place among the saints was her heroism, fortitude. She endured that ordeal of her trial, and she was profoundly convinced of the justice of her cause. In many ways, she was a victim of internal strife. She was condemned by judges and assessors who are almost entirely Northern French. But she has become a symbol of national identity with the French. And people of whatever creed or party have rallied around her. She's revered as a saint, as a soldier, a citizen, a woman of faith, a woman of courage. And of course, the fact that she was not only a woman, but a peasant woman, really a girl by our standards, she was 19 when she was killed, has made her a symbol of many things. It's interesting, unsurprisingly, feminist movements have tended to claim her as a sort of uber feminist, but she really didn't challenge the patriarchal structures. She just operated as an individual she believed under the direct guidance of God and his saints, without saying that should be a model for anyone else. But it has certainly been an important part of her legacy, particularly in the last century or so. She's also been seen when France was under attack in World War I and World War II. Remember, she wasn't saying it until 1920. She's been held up as a symbol of French resistance against foreign invaders. Now that's a little, obviously anachronistic, but it was done. Weirdly enough, during the German occupation in World War II, the Vichy regime and the French resistance claimed her as an inspiration. The Vichy types claimed she was anti-Semitic. Absolutely no proof, no even reason to believe that, except that they needed some help with their great enterprise of destroying an entire race of people. Her symbolism is extraordinarily strong. So that's Joan of Arc. And I've got another saint I want to talk to you about. Don't worry, this is one you've never heard of.
Randall, one question. Where does the word arc come from? Joan of Arc.
It's the area where she was born.
Okay.
Sorry, it's her family name.
Okay.
Arc, and it's where they came from.
Okay.
It's not A-R-K.
No, ARC.
Yeah.
Are there any of her relatives still alive today?
I have no idea. I really don't. I wouldn't be surprised. It would be likely. No, it's quite likely. Now I want to talk to you about another guy. And actually, he's a near contemporary. He was born much earlier than Joan, but she didn't live long. And I'm going to be surprised if any of you have ever heard of this guy. If you are, I'm going to be disappointed, because I had not. And man, was I impressed. Okay. His name is Nuno Alvarez Pereira. Anybody ever heard of that guy? Portuguese. Okay. I chose him to sort of throw a contrast between him and Joan. It's a contrast, but there are a lot of similarities. And I just found him fascinating, particularly because I'd never heard of it. He was born in Portugal. He was the illegitimate son of a priest named Gonçalves Pereira, and his grandfather was the Archbishop of Braga, and his descent through his father, his illegitimate descent, was from very old Portuguese nobility, and they were still a very important family. And about a year after his birth, he was legitimized by royal decree, which enabled him to be sent for a thorough education and to be treated as any other offspring of a noble family. And it obviously worked. I mean, here's, Joan's out being peasant girl, and what's he doing? At 13, he became a page to the Queen of Portugal. And at 16, he was married to a rich young widow. They had 3 children, 2 boys who died young, and a girl named Beatrice. She later married the son of King John I. So she became Queen of Portugal. So this guy is the farthest thing from a peasant. He began his military service when he was only 13, and actually fought in some way during an invasion from Castile. Remember, Spain, like France, is has not always been one country. And at this time, there were a number of kingdoms in Spain, and the Castilians believed that they could take over Portugal. The Portuguese had other ideas. According to his own recorded words, his first military campaigns were just skirmishes along the borders of Portugal. But he had distinguished himself as being brave, if somewhat impetuous, and that he was someone who, even though he was young, men were willing to follow him. This is, the result of a very class society. When King Ferdinand of Portugal died in 1383, his only heir married Joan of Castile. In order to preserve Portuguese independence, the nobles supported the claim of King Ferdinand's half-brother, John, to the throne. And he was able to beat back the attack of the Castilians, who claimed the throne because their king had married the only daughter of the now dead king of Portugal. So after the Battle of, I can't even pronounce it, big battle in 1384, Nuno Alves Pereira was named Protector and Constable of Portugal, Supreme Commander of Portugal's armies, and the Count of Oran. There were only 3 counts in Portugal at this time. That's how high the title was in Portugal. He was 24 years old. This was because he had commanded at that battle, where, although heavily outnumbered, they had won. They had beaten back the Castilians. The Castilians came back, and this time he couldn't beat them. In the open, he just knew he didn't have the troops. The key to the outcome of this particular war with the Castilians was a siege of Lisbon. Lisbon was then, and as it is now, the capital of Portugal. And Alves Pereira, who had been so successful on the battlefield, knew that this wouldn't work. And he instead attacked the Castilians by disrupting their supply lines, making it difficult for them to keep their army fed, and so forth and so forth. Buying time, and finally the plague arose in the Castilian camp as well as in Lisbon, and they pulled out. Yet again, the Castilians came back. Nuno Alves Pereira was engaged against northern cities, and during this time, even though these cities had been loyal to the Castilians, he fed the populations of these cities at his own personal expense. His greatest victory came in 1385. And this, I couldn't believe I'd never heard of this. This is on a scale with Cannae or Chancellorsville. He had an army of 6,500 men, a couple of companies of English archers, and the rest mostly peasants, mostly militia, peasant militia. The Castilian force was 30,000, plus 4,000 French knights. And he won. He won. It was an absolute tactical masterpiece. Unbelievable. 6,500, most of whom were peasant militia, beating a professional army of 34,000 men. And that was it. The Castilians said, we can't beat this guy, we're not coming back. He attributed the victory to the Virgin, and had the name Mary inscribed on his sword. He dedicated himself to the Virgin and fasted 3 days a week. His personal standard, and I mentioned the personal standard when I was talking about Joan, this is very typical right up through the 19th century that generals, commanders in general, would design a personal standard for themselves, which would be displayed wherever they were. This could be very useful, obviously, in a number of different ways. On his standard bore the image of the cross, Mary, and 2 saints, James and George, both of whom were warrior saints. At his own expense, he built numerous churches and monasteries, many of which actually are still around. After this defeat in 1385, Carlos Ferreira was made count of the other 2 lands which were counted as counts' fiefs, which meant he was the only count in Portugal. He had all 3 of them. Those other counties had been taken away from nobles who had taken a part of Castile. The kings of Portugal decided that they wanted to make sure the Castilians didn't come back, so they went to war against them and invaded Castile, just to teach them a lesson, and he once again defeated a much larger Castilian army. And he continued to keep an eye out on this until 1390, at which point it was obvious that the Castilians had given up their desire to subjugate Portugal and incorporated it into Castile. He gave away most of his money immediately. And after the death of his wife, he became a friar. He entered the order in 1423 and entered a convent in Lisbon. Convent meaning a male order house for the Carmelites. And he had founded it as this particular convent as he had made a vow that if he could be successful in saving Portugal from the Castilians, he would build and found and fund a monastic order, which he did, a monastic house, which he did. He lived there until 1431. He was noted for his fervency in prayer, his practice of penance, his deep devotion to the Virgin. He suffered from rheumatoid arthritis and was really crippled and in pain for most of the last of his life. During the last year of his life, King John I went to visit him and to say goodbye. He said that weeping, he said that he considered Pereira to be his closest friend, the man who had put him on the throne and saved his country's independence. He was buried in Lisbon, and his tomb was lost in the famous 1755 Lisbon earthquake, which was one of the great natural disasters to strike Europe in the 18th century. epitaph was, fortunately it was preserved. Here lies that famous Nuno, the constable meaning chief military officer, not law enforcement guy. Nuno the constable, founder of the House of Braganza, excellent general, blessed monk, who during his life on earth so ardently desired the kingdom of heaven that after his death he merited the eternal company of the saints. His worldly honors were countless, but he turned his back on them. He was a great prince, but he made himself a humble monk. He founded, built, and endowed this church in which his body rests. And I was just struck by, here are two saints primarily remembered for military accomplishments, from totally different backgrounds, and serving monarchs of a totally different degree of trustworthiness. I'm not a big fan of Charles VI. I think he treated Joan shabbily, very shabbily. Whereas, anyhow, but I found him to be of great interest. Now, next week, meet on Wednesday, and we're going to look at another case. I'm sure there will be others later, but we're going to look at another case of the dark underbelly of church trials. It's time. I've done all of this up to this point has been centered on very much, I think, on other than some of the very early Celtic saints, been centered very much on the continent, and during the period of the papacy, when the papacy controlled the continent. Next week, I want to go to England and talk about Sir Thomas More. So if you feel a deep need for homework, go watch A Man Crawl Season, and then we'll talk about that. Oh, and by the way, I did discover one other thing about Joan, which sort of amused me. There have been a number of films made about her. One of them starred Ingrid Bergman. Have y'all anybody seen this? You've seen it? Yeah.
Black and white.
Yeah, and there was apparently a lot of criticism of her for wanting to do that role because she was in her mid-30s and she got it 19. But it was very well received, and it was a very successful film. There have been others, some of which probably more in French than anything else. Joan has been the subject of operas. She has been the subject of books, and a lot of scholarly interest, and she continues to be an important and lively person in French culture. Now, I don't know how Pereira is remembered in Portugal because I don't know that much about Portugal, but I hope he's remembered because I think he certainly deserves it. And obviously an extraordinarily gifted military leader, and yet willing and able, when it came to an end, to walk away from it all. And that's impressive. So, any comments or questions? I know I've dumped a lot on you tonight, but I really like Pereira. I'm glad I had time pushing it.
Go ahead.
You said that she broke, that Joan of Arc broke at one point. Could you comment more on that, on what
Yeah,
might
she was
have
scared to
prompted-
death.
But then scared to death, and then she went back after a couple of days of thinking about it. I mean, that whole dynamic, could you
She
comment a little
claimed
on
that the saints had appeared to her,
Yeah.
spoken to her, and told her that she was a traitor for doing that,
Uh-huh.
that she was a traitor to God. And so she revoked her revocation.
Okay. All right.
A teenager.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. I'm done with
It
this.
changed her mind. Shocking, right?
Are there any relics of Joan of Arc?
No, I don't believe so. I'm pretty sure she was one of those whose body was destroyed in the French Revolution. Let me look, I could be wrong. I've done so much reading on so many saints lately.
Well, she was
She
burned at the
burned,
stake,
she
there
was
wasn't,
Burned. Yeah.
Burns is
yeah.
pretty much,
I mean,
maybe her
But
teeth.
sometimes there are relics of the second sort,
Right.
meaning,
Oh.
you know, objects that she had
Oh.
touched or whatever. Let me see.
well, I think there were some in that museum, weren't there?
Relics of Joan of Arc.
Swords.
The only definitively authenticated her personal silver gilt ring, which was seized upon her capture and returned to France in 2016.
What?
2016.
Yep.
All that time.
Other claimed items, listen, even though it's against the law, Wisconsin still got some Confederate flags. In 2016, other claimed items, including bones and fabric found in 1867, were scientifically proven in 2007 to be a 3rd to 6th century BC Egyptian mummy. Several documents signed by her exist, along with items she used. Apparently the ring, a small simple brass or silver gilt ring with Jesus and Mary engraved on it, which she cherished, taken by Beaufort after her trial and remained in England for 600 years. There are several letters dictated by her that remain. Items she famously used or prayed before. Statues, like, you know, in various places. The ring is the only object that has survived with a documented, unbroken chain of custody. But, right, her body was burned, so they probably destroyed everything. Sir?
Did you say that the British paid for her defense?
No, they paid for the trial.
Oh, they paid for the trial.
Oh, yeah.
Never mind.
Oh, yeah. And
For the prosecution.
the Burgundians took the lead in it, but the British paid for it.
And
It's hard to realize how powerful Burgundy was, but it was very powerful. Really rivals to the Valois.
so really internal not squabbling, but.
Yeah, rivalry of
Mhm.
a high order. Okay.
Thanks, sir.
Well, next week, we'll talk about Thomas More and maybe somebody else I don't know. And God willing, I'll see you all on Wednesday.
Should we watch that movie ahead of time?
Yeah, if you like, I'll warn you, it's
I watched it, but
I've
see it
been
again.
30 years.
It's quite romanticized, and there's a much more nuanced picture of Thomas that can
Hollywood.
emerge. Yeah, he's
Tom-
an interesting guy.
His name Pereira?
Yeah.
Pereira.
Thank you, Randall.
Anybody else? No? Okay. Well, I did my best.